Warehouse capacity. It's a very common problem these days. I've talked to people every week who are running out of warehouse capacity and they're wondering what to do. Do they move to a bigger facility? Do they lease an extra facility? Hopefully, there are some tricks that we're going to learn in this video that will solve it for you. Coming right up. So welcome back, John Monk. We're going to be talking about warehouse capacity.
Hi, Rob.
So for those of you who haven't met John before, John's one of our specialist consultants in warehousing here at Logistics Bureau. He spends his life fixing up warehouses and capacity problems and that type of thing. So, John, I'm sure you'd agree that we see a lot of organizations wanting to move warehouses or worried that they're running out of capacity. What are some of the things that people should be looking at and maybe some of the quick fixes to, I guess, try to alleviate that problem?
Yeah, no, definitely a problem that you come across quite often where the warehouse manager is telling you and the business is telling you that they're full. And from a practical sense, what they're usually saying is that they've got no more location or got very few locations left in their warehouse to goods are coming in, and particularly if it's a seasonal business and they want to build stock for Christmas, for example, then they're trying to find space and they end up going over full, and that creates congestion. Often if they're too full, they'll be walking around looking for a spare location, so they're wasting time in that respect. So what one tip that I'd give our clients is, in terms of walking around, what I often look for when I've heard that they're too full or they've got too much product, is I try to actually look in from a location perspective, they're full, but then I try and look from a I'll call it a cubic capacity perspective. Are they full? And what I mean by that, they might have a pallet or a shelf with product in it, but how much free space is available across the storage system, the racking or the shelving? And what I often find is that while they're full from a location perspective, they're not necessarily full from a capacity perspective. And probably one of the lowest cost approaches to creating some extra space is, if you've got standard racking, is just putting in some more shelving or some more beams by compressing that free space that's sitting there and creating an extra shelf level or an extra half pallet level. And often I'll see half pallets in full pallet position. So putting the extra locations in by putting extra beams or extra shelves means that you're getting better utilization of that cubic capacity, and therefore you're creating more capacity. It would be one probably very low cost way of addressing the problem, potentially, depending on obviously your business.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen that so many times, and for people watching this, don't get the idea here that John's suggesting we're constantly moving beams and adjusting the size of pallet slots and picking slots and so on. But you very often see in a warehouse that a lot of the pallets are just consistently low pallets, and some are consistently very high pallets.
Yeah.
And so you can adjust the sort of pallet slots to fit that.
Exactly.
And get another level in, perhaps.
Yes, perhaps.
Yeah.
The second area, of course, is looking at your inventory. And I'll say, but what I mean by looking at your inventory is, do you have excess inventory? Do you have slow or obsolete inventory? And particularly identifying what we call slob, the slow and obsolete. Potentially you can take a different strategy with that inventory. Obviously, if it's obsolete, you've got to really question whether you keep it. And that's can be hard for some businesses. But from a cash perspective, of course, you paid for it, but it's still costing you space, and it's costing you inefficiency. So when you start to look at it from that perspective, maybe you should get rid of it. But if you want to keep it, or if it's what I call very slow, like you may only pick it once every few months, then potentially another way of getting better utilization of a location is to commingle. Now, ordinarily, from a best practice perspective, I'd be the first one to say, one SKU per location is the best way to go. But I'm talking about, your ABC SKUs. I'm not talking about SKUs that are in that slob category. And often what we find is if you identify all those products, put them all together, wrap them up on a pallet and put them, high up in the racking, so that, it's out the way and you create space. So it's sort of creating space by reviewing inventory. But there's a couple of, different ways, as I started off saying with that, make sure that you've got the right levels of inventory to support the business.
Yeah. So you mentioned there a little bit about seasonality. Funnily enough, I was talking with a client yesterday, and they get a big surge pre-Christmas. I won't say what the products are, but so they've got to build product. It's imported products. They've got a stock build prior to Christmas. They have a big December, January. What would you say to companies, let's pick a number where maybe their inventory increases 10 or 20% into a peak season, whether it's Christmas, Easter, summer holidays, whatever. I mean, we wouldn't normally design a warehouse to that capacity, would you? Or would you try and get around it in other ways?
Oh, look, it partly depends on the business, Rob, but I've been involved in FMCG businesses where we had exactly that challenge. And, we weren't going to put another warehouse in. And so often when we're talking about a lot of volume is, can you find some, I'll call it surge storage or offsite storage that, can complement, what you're doing. And it's just that, 1 month or 2 months of the year that you need the extra space. So that it comes down to a commercial exercise as to, do I build a warehouse that can take 100%? And of course, if you're growing, at some point you're going to potentially run out of room again. Or do I build a warehouse that covers the majority of what I do? And then, while it may cost me more, in the end, it's cheaper than having a big, large warehouse.
Yeah, and whether it's sort of, containers out the back or outside storage under an awning, or, there's all sorts of ways around it. But
I didn't go down the container out the back. I mean, if you own the containers, fine, but container detention charges are horrendous.
Yeah, of course.
Unless unless you're a really big importer and can negotiate some free.
Anyone from the mining industry who's watching this, you'd know all about containers out the back.
Yes, well, that's right.
It seems to be a thing in the mining industry.
Well, if they own the containers, that's probably okay. But otherwise the detention on costs are just enormous. They penalise you for holding up their containers, because obviously they're required for international trade. So
exactly. But I suppose the point we're touching on here is that you're not necessarily designing for the peak. If you've got a peak inventory during a month or so, look at ways of outside storage, reducing.
I mean, there's quite a few infrastructure. I mean, again, as you say, you talked about mining, but there's quite a few infrastructure clients, and you actually say, well, do I actually need to store this, inside? And I've seen plenty of infrastructure businesses. They'll rack hard stand areas and they'll store those industrial products outside.
That's right.
Because
products that are going to be out in the weather anyway when they're in use. Exactly. Okay. So we've talked about utilizing the cube. We've talked about managing the inventory better. What would be a third one?
Look, I suppose in the end, there are maybe some options around the storage system itself in terms of how dense you store products. So there are, and particularly if we start to move in, when I talk denser storage systems, we start to move into some of the automation solutions, things like the Adapto or the Auto Store or a mini load system, which this is more for smaller parts or in totes, and basically you take away all the aisleways and the products are stored in the storage system, and they're recovered by a robotic automated mobile robot, or like a crane system, which is all there to reduce the space. Now, the numbers there can be quite, carousels are another example of that type of technology.
Vertical lift machines.
Yes. Yeah. So the better utilization of that cube can reduce the amount of floor area, typically quoted up to 80%. So, if you're needing more space, it's around, utilizing a much denser storage system. But I guess what goes with this now is the extra capital costs of those storage systems. So then you've got to look at that perspective of, I don't move warehouse, but I, have to employ some more capital to put this equipment in. But often also that what goes with this type of equipment is rather than a person going and picking it, it's a goods to person system. So something like a vertical lift machine brings the product to the person. So the productivity rates that you can also get out of these this type of equipment is far greater than a more manual warehouse. But yeah, it's really, in summary, it's that the density of your storage system in itself. If you can somehow create a more dense storage system, you can obviously store more and therefore create more capacity to store.
I was just going to say, with those high density systems, be they carousels, vertical lift machines, others, a lot of the secret to that is how you're loading the product into them as well, isn't it? I mean, we recently did a video on slotting. There's a whole slotting exercise that goes about where to put the product in there so that you can really get good productivity. And I think in the past, a lot of people used to think of these high density storage systems as being really good for slow movers. But loaded well, they can be pretty good for quite fast movers too, can't they?
Oh, they certainly can impact the pick rate. One comment here about slotting, since we've touched on it, is I've seen businesses where they've had multiple vertical lift machines and they haven't thought about that slotting question, and they might put all the fast moving items into one machine. And that machine
crowded around it.
that machine is working so hard, and the others are just twiddling their thumbs. So again, what we call workload balancing across those different machines is an important part of slotting, which I hadn't mentioned in our other video. But balancing the workload in zones is an important way of making sure that you're getting proper utilization of all the machines and getting the greatest throughput through those vertical lift machines or zonal picking systems or whatever they are, is to make sure they're balanced in terms of the work activity.
I suppose just to sort of round this off, something we haven't touched on, because it's actually really simple, is looking at things like aisle widths. I mean, as you were talking, I was thinking of an example of a company that you did some work with, which had pretty wide aisles, and they were going to have to move the warehouse. But actually, you narrowed up the aisles, utilized slightly different forklifts. And how much extra space did you get? Was it 30%?
It was nearly 30% extra space. So I suppose that was my comment about denser systems. In that particular case, yes, I remember it well, is we narrowed the aisles up and used different type of mobile equipment. In this case, it was articulated forklifts, so they can turn in much narrower aisles than a standard reach truck. And we also did more levels. So overall, we got 30% more locations. And the reason that particular client, if I recall, didn't want to go to another warehouse, is they actually owned this warehouse. So, rather than having two warehouses, have one warehouse and make it efficient. So that's what they ended up doing, was re-racking. And that particular case, they got it all re-racked while they still operated. So, business.
They did it in like 5 or 6 weeks, didn't they? Just
that's right. It
was doing a couple of rows each weekend.
Yeah, exactly. They're sort of normal business during the week, and then they change things out on the weekend. So that was always a juggling act. Yeah,
there we go. So thank you for that, John. Some simple tips on how to increase the capacity of your warehouse if you're running out of a bit. It doesn't always mean you have to move or lease a new warehouse or anything like that. You can extend the life of a warehouse just by a few simple measures. So in terms of additional resources, let's put some links down below in the video description, and I'll try to remember to put a link to that slotting video, which is very relevant. And also, if you need some help, obviously, with laying out your warehouses and tackling these problems, we'll put a contact link down below as well. So thank you for watching. Thank you again, John, for joining us.
Thank you.